everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Kathleen McNerney. I am the senior producer and editor of our education team, Edify. We cover everything from preschool to postdoc, as they say, especially through narrative journalism. So we try to look at inequities in the system and make it make sense, whether you have kids in school, you're paying off your student loans from 30 years ago, and just serve you with that information. Tonight, I am so excited to introduce Paul Tough. He is the author of 3 previous books, including the best-selling How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. It's been translated into 27 languages. He's a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, a regular contributor to This American Life, and an acclaimed speaker on education, inequality, and success. And interviewing him tonight is Michael Pollan. For more than 30 years, Michael Pollan has been writing books and articles about the places where nature and culture intersect, on our plates, in our farms and gardens, and in our minds. His latest book, How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. So they will be up here. I'm really happy to listen to the conversation. Keep in mind that if you don't have a copy of either of their books, you can purchase them in the lobby afterwards, and they will also be signing books. Also, one more note of housekeeping. If you go to slido.com, you can ask your questions through your phones, which they'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the conversation. The password is right behind me. I will get out of the way so you can actually see it. So just go on slido.com, enter that password, hashtag PT913, and you can ask your questions, which they can take. All right, without further ado, Paul Tough and Michael Pollan. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Very exciting to be in this new space, this spanking new space, and particularly excited to be here with Paul Tough and to be in conversation with him for 2 reasons. One is we've been in conversation since the mid-1980s, I think, in one way or another. We worked together for many years at Harper's Magazine, but also because of this remarkable book he's written. It's just a stunning piece of work that is ostensibly about higher education, about the college experience, but and on that level, it's just a kind of completely absorbing narrative with some very surprising, trenchant analysis. But it's also a lot more than that. It's a book about class in America. It's a book about social mobility. And it's a devastating report card on the American dream. So it's just a very special book, and I was very pleased when Paul asked if I would interview him at this event. So I want to start. I don't mean to sound too much like Chris Wallace, but to talk to you about college as an authority, given that you dropped out twice. Why should we trust you on this subject? Never completed, as I recall.
Yeah, starting with the hardball questions. I appreciate it. Thank you, first of all, to all of you for coming to WBUR, and especially to Michael for being here. Yes, so that is the dark secret that I never confess in the 400 pages of this book, that I never graduated from college. I dropped out twice. I was very persistent in my dropping out. I dropped out first from Columbia University, and then went to McGill for a while, and then dropped out of there. And the reason I dropped out the second time was to do an internship at Harper's Magazine, where
I was partly responsible,
yes,
I think,
Michael
for the
Pollan
second dropout.
And I thought I might go back, but at that moment, and with some lucky breaks, including with Michael's help, I was able to just stay a journalist. So part of the reason why I didn't write about it is that, I think it certainly has something to do with my interest in the topic, and I think it has something to do with my skepticism about higher education. So, I end up in this book being, I think it's pretty clear from the evidence from economics and the individual stories of lots of young people that a college degree really pays off in today's economy. But I understand that there is a big level of skepticism in the population about the value of college, and I think I kind of share that because I experienced it for myself when I was a college student. But I think part of the reason I didn't write about it is that I don't really think you can extrapolate too much from my experience. I feel like when there are people who drop out of college and have successful careers, we want to say, oh, just shows young kids today they don't need to go to college, and they do. So that's part of why I don't talk about it too much.
Okay. And your interest in education, you've now been writing about education for 15 or so years. Curious how you hit on that topic and what about it has held your interest?
Well, so I guess there's a couple answers. So despite the fact that I'm a dropout, there are nothing but educators in my family. My parents are both educators. My grandfather was a superintendent of schools in Canada. So there's a lot of it going around. So when I became a journalist, I was sort of the black sheep of the family for a while until I started writing about education, and then I got invited back to family gatherings. So that's part of it. But I actually don't necessarily feel like an education writer. I mean, I appreciate what you said. It was very generous that this book is about more than education. And I really feel like I'm writing about mobility and opportunity. And that is intertwined with education in this country. And so what drew me to this topic was not so much wanting to write about the ins and outs of higher education policy, but just about the role that it plays both in our country and in our system of mobility and in the lives of lots of young people. That's what drew me to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me you use education as a lens to look at bigger issues, and that it's a very interesting entree point to look at class and social advancement and where we get kind of stuck as a society. When I talk to people about college, and I'm an educator now too. I teach writing, both at Berkeley and Harvard, and I talk to high school students a lot and their parents, and I always counsel them not to stress as much as they are. I mean, people are just insane about college admissions, as you well know, and my advice is always, you're going to get in somewhere. A very high percentage of people stay where they go and like where they are. So why be so crazed about it? Why put so much mental energy into it? And in a way, one of the surprising takeaways of your book is they're right to be crazy about it. They're right to think that it's so momentous. And maybe you could talk a little bit about why that is.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the distressing realizations. And I mean, I still do feel like for any individual student, your advice is still good. And I think a lot of people are too stressed out about it. I think that's especially true for young people with some family resources, where you go to college matters more if you are low income than if you're high income. But the thing that really convinced me that it mattered more than we wish it mattered was this study by Raj Chetty, who is now a Harvard economist, but when I was reporting with him, he was at Stanford. And this mobility report card study that he came out with a few years ago demonstrated that the more selective the institution you go to, for the most part, the higher your lifetime income is going to be. So if you go to what he calls an Ivy Plus college, there's a 1 in 5 chance.
What is that?
Oh, sorry, Ivy Plus is the Ivy League plus 4 Ivy-ish universities. If you go to one of those schools, you have a 1 in 5 chance as a young adult to be in the top 1% of income earners. And if you go to a school that's one tier lower, so super selective but not quite that selective, you have a 1 in 11 chance. And if you go to a community college, you have a 1 in 300 chance. So to the degree that how much money you make in your mid-30s matters, it matters where you go to college. And fortunately, there are a lot of people out there who don't care that much about being in the top 1% in their mid-30s. But I feel like that particular advice, which I think is wise for any individual, I don't want it to distract us from the fact that opportunity is being so unevenly distributed, especially given the fact that those most selective institutions tend to enroll so many rich kids and so few poor kids. And so the combination of a system that where the outcomes are so uneven and the opportunities are so uneven is the sort of toxic combination that we've got.
So in that research, though, I mean, there are two ways to understand that. One is that the schools themselves are conferring the advantage on those people because they're educating them so well or spending so much money on them, or that these are people destined for success because they're at the top of whatever metric you want to use. So which is it?
I think it's a little of both. And so my understanding is that Raj and his colleagues, I think some of whom are here today, are trying to figure that out next, that's their next project. But there is another paper, another study by a Stanford economist named Carolyn Hawksby that I drew on early on in the book, that where she actually uses both data from the IRS and data from the College Board to see where individuals choose to go to college and whether it makes a difference. And this has actually been a long-running debate among economists. Is it just a selection effect or is there another effect? She makes a pretty persuasive case that for any individual, choosing a highly selective college instead of a less selective one makes millions of dollars of difference in your lifetime earnings.
And what is that about, though? Is that the reputation of the school, the magic of an Ivy League diploma, or is it the fact that those top schools, as you say in the book, spend more money per student?
Yeah, that's what she can't show, and I think certainly part of it is right. If Mark Zuckerberg is your freshman roommate, that is a really good sign for your future earnings. And even short of that, I think there are all sorts of connections that people make. There's a halo effect. There is just the social capital that you gain from being at a highly selective institution. But I do feel like there's something about the education itself. So another finding of Carolyn Hawksby is that I think is important is just how much different institutions spend on their students. And she traces it all the way down from the least selective community colleges that are spending $4,000 or $5,000 a year on each student, much less than a high school spends on each high school student, all the way up to the most selective Ivy schools, which are spending $150,000 to $200,000. And what struck me about
so they're spending a lot more than you pay to go there.
Exactly. So every student who is at one of those institutions, who are mostly affluent, is getting a great deal. They're getting an investment by those institutions in them. And you can say, like, is that education really? Do you see that full $200,000 worth of investment? And I don't know. I mean, I feel like we want to be skeptical about the value of that education because we don't want to believe that it is valuable and that it is so unequally distributed. But the one Ivy League school where I did some reporting was Princeton, where I was spending time with a young low-income first-generation student named Kiki Gilbert, who was enrolled in this thing called the Humanities Sequence at Princeton, and sitting there watching her in class in this class that is like 100 students where they read all the great books, and they have, I think, 12 different professors, and they have these small conversations in beautiful drawing rooms about great books, and like the value that was being conveyed to Kiki and to her mostly wealthy classmates, I could see how that was going to lead in a really direct way to her future earnings if she wanted.
Yeah, I mean, some of that spending goes right to the student in that kind of smaller classes, but some of it could be just overpaid professors.
Do you have anyone in mind?
who are there because of their research.
Yeah.
And I don't know to what extent that's filtering down to the students, but
Yeah.
but of course those are in some cases influential professors who help them get into graduate school. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the idea of college as this engine of social mobility, as this escalator, is very deeply ingrained, I think. We believed it for a long time, but it probably hasn't always been the case, right? I mean, elite colleges were reproducing class structure in America for a long time. When does it begin? Does it begin with the GI Bill?
I think it does. I mean, so these two historians, economists, Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz, published this great book called The Race Between Education and Technology, in which they trace the way that in the 20th century education expands. And it was, in their telling, a gradual process. But I think there was something about that moment after World War II and the GI Bill, and I write a little bit about the GI Bill in the book, where the numbers certainly went up pretty quickly. The undergraduate student population doubled in a few years, from the last few years of World War II to the first few years of the post-war era. But I think as important as that, the idea of who could be a college student changed. And before that, only about 10% of young people were going to college. And it was mostly the same rich prep school kids that had always been educated by the same small number of elite institutions. And so it was just assumed that's what college was. It didn't have much to do with social mobility. It had to do with social closure. It just had to do with keeping those rich kids rich. And they weren't even really supposed to be learning anything. They were just going and learning how to wear the right socks with the right suit and go to the right debutante balls. And then all these GIs show up. And there was this great moment after the GI Bill passed and right before the end of World War II. I'll take one step back. So when Congress was debating the GI Bill, they didn't think anyone was going to show up because of this idea that college was for these rich Harvard guys. And then after the GI Bill passed and right before the end of World War II, there started to be this chorus of concern that maybe these guys would actually show up. And the two loudest voices in this chorus were the president of Harvard and the president of the University of Chicago, who both published essays saying, we have got to stop this GI Bill now. We've got to put a test on it so that only the most qualified students will show up, because these were the sons of farmers, the daughters of dock workers. They were all going to show up. And the president of the University of Chicago had a really memorable phrase. He said we would have educational hobo jungles if all of these GI Bills came back. And they were right. All of these people showed up. And they turned out to be great students, and they outperformed the rich kids who were there before them. And people started writing about it. There were these articles in the Saturday Evening Post and the New York Times Magazine describing these new college students. And those articles actually had this big effect. It changed people's minds about what a college student could be. And so I think that era right after World War II, which was also the era where public universities started being built and expanding quickly into the 60s, that I think was the era where we felt like, yes, this is what they're for. They're for social mobility.
And they succeeded. I mean, they did succeed for a very long time, bringing people into the middle class. And it went way beyond the GI Bill, right? Because you have all this spending on education. Federal spending on education was also, you don't talk about this that much, but it had a lot to do with the Cold War, right? I mean, we really we were willing to invest in undergraduate education because this was going to prove that we were a superior country in certain ways, not to mention developing technology and all this kind of stuff. So when does it stop working?
It's a good question. So, I think things, a lot of things started to change in the 80s, and a lot of the sort of social divisions that we see now, the separation of the classes, I think, began then. So I would trace some of it back then. I don't think there was any one particular moment. I mean, some of it has happened just in the last decade or so. I mean, there are a couple of big trends, I think, that are behind this inequity. One is this change in, or this sort of fact in admissions that there's so much intense competition for these small number of seats. There's been the high-scoring students now only want to go to colleges where other high-scoring students are going. So that has led to this kind of concentration, stratification of wealth and of high scores. But the other thing that's happened on the other end is that we have stopped funding public education, public higher education, the way that we used to. And a lot of that has just been since the recession. So the recession 10 or 12 years ago, when that came, state budgets, tax revenue went way down, and a lot of them cut their public funding on higher education by huge amounts. And then when the recovery came, the funding didn't come back. So the number that I saw most recently is that since 2001, our public higher education budgets have been cut on average by 16% per student, adjusted for inflation, which is a really big cut. Like 16% is a big cut over these 2 decades when all of the signs from the economy, from the labor market, are that in fact we need more and better educated young people. So I think that combination of factors has created this, has just sort of pulled apart the two sides and created this inequity.
I certainly saw that at Berkeley, where just in the last 10 years, tuition has gone up dramatically. And the school has been forced to take, full boat paying students from other states, and all the public universities are doing that. They're acting much more like private universities in every respect. So there's also a discourse out there about that maybe college isn't worth it. And you wrote, there's an excerpt or a piece in The Atlantic today that you published about this idea. And Republicans talk a lot about vocational education, that we shouldn't fetishize four-year college, and that you cite the example of the welder who makes $150,000, and we should be, maybe we're channeling too many people into college. Will you just kind of review that argument and your counter to it?
Sure. Well, I mean, the part of that argument is absolutely true. So, four-year, liberal arts degrees are certainly not for everyone, and we should have lots of other alternatives. The problem is, in order to create those alternatives, we need a well-funded education system, especially community colleges. And there's this rhetoric that gets used, especially by conservative politicians, especially on certain cable news channels, that argues that there are options beyond a college degree that are very high-paying, very lucrative, and in fact more lucrative than a four-year degree. And I trace this back to this one article in the Wall Street Journal in 2014, where a Republican politician said that in Ohio there were welders making $150,000 a year, and that they were the ones who were benefiting, but there weren't enough people to take those jobs. And this got then repeated by Marco Rubio in a debate. It got repeated in other articles in the Wall Street Journal, and then on Fox News, and Fox News Business just became this kind of drumbeat, that there were all these manual labor jobs out there that were paying great wages and asking because millennial snowflakes didn't want to get their hands dirty, while meanwhile people who had college degrees were working in Starbucks. There are examples of both of these things being true, but the general picture is exactly the opposite, right? So it is very hard to make a living these days, a middle-class living, without some kind of post-secondary credential. The average salary for a welder is $41,000, which is not bad if you're just starting out, but that's the average. That's the median salary, and most of those people are men in their 40s and 50s supporting a family. It's a very hard job. And so I followed a welder for a while, a welding student, a young man named Ori in western North Carolina, as he was trying to make his way through college, and discovered, as I watched him try to find his way to a welding degree, that there were a couple of real flaws in the rhetoric about welding as an alternative to college. The first one being that in order to become a welder, you have to go to college. So he was enrolled in a 2-year program at Catawba Valley Community College. Welding is hard, and there's a lot that he had to learn. There were 12 different actual technical courses that he had to take. He had to take a course in metallurgy and English and math, and his college was one of these colleges that was having its funds cut. The amount that North Carolina spends on each community college student while he was there got cut from about $5,000 to about $4,000. And so those cuts, he saw that in his tuition going up. He saw that in the resources that his college had going down. So that was part of it. The other one was that there were no $150,000 welding jobs that he could find. The most that he could find was jobs that paid $12 or $15 an hour. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand where that rhetoric came from and what purpose it serves. And It's hard to tell, for sure. I mean, I think part of it is just nostalgia. It would be great if there were $150,000 welding jobs. It would be great if someone like Ori could support his family with a welding job. There was a time where that was true in the United States, where there were lots of opportunities for people who got out of high school and didn't particularly love school, like Ori.
And there were unions.
Yeah, and there were unions, and there are very few unions in North Carolina. None of his factory jobs were union jobs, so he is getting screwed by our economy. And I think that the other reason for that rhetoric is that we want to avert our eyes, or either avert our eyes from the fact that he's getting screwed, or genuinely mislead him about the way that he's getting screwed. And in some ways it's working. I mean, I feel like in North Carolina the budgets just keep getting cut, and that's really hard, I think, for the students who are there. So it's always hard to tell people's motivations and figure out where it starts from.
I mean,
but it seems
there are other
not a
bases
coincidence.
for right-wing hostility toward universities, right? I mean, tenured radicals and all that kind of stuff. Let's shift a little and talk about admissions and the whole process. I want to start with the admissions scandals of the last year, which I realize happened after you finished the book. But here we have a system that ostensibly serves the interests of the well-to-do. You make a very powerful case. That's essentially what elite colleges are doing. Nevertheless, the well-to-do are willing to cheat to assure a place for their kids in the best possible schools. What did you take away from these scandals? Is it a symptom of something larger? I mean, or is it, what does it tell us?
I think it's definitely a symptom of something larger. I mean, I got to write a little bit, a few paragraphs about the admission scandal at the beginning of the book, but it did mostly break after I had finished writing. But I went back and read a lot of the FBI wiretaps of Rick Singer, the crooked college coach at the center of the scandal, on the phone while the FBI was listening with these various parents. And what struck me in listening to them talk is that they didn't sound like they were in the middle of a criminal conspiracy, despite the fact that they were doing these crazy things and photoshopping their kids' faces onto other people's bodies and things like that. They sounded exactly like every other affluent parent with kids trying to get them into college. Like they just couldn't believe how crazy the system was. And I think what most parents with advantages realize is that this is an uneven and unfair system. And if they think about it for a few minutes, they realize that they have the advantage in this system. But like all of us, you can see someone else down the street who you think has even more money, even more advantage. And I think there's this urge, there's this tendency to feel like if it's an unfair system, if it's rigged, then there are no rules, right? So you should just do whatever you can to get your kid in if everyone else is breaking the rules. Obviously, they took things past a certain line. There is a difference between breaking the law and not breaking the law, as Felicity Huffman will be discovering for 14 days coming up soon. But I think that their impulses were just the same. And so I do think that it's instructive. I think it tells us something about how so many parents think about college admissions, that their job is their job is just to get whatever they can, that it's completely not a collective good at all, higher education. It's just a consumer good. It's a scarce resource, a scarce commodity, and therefore there are no restrictions on what you should be able to do in order to get your kid in.
And what about, there's some legal scams too, right? SAT prep, for example. I mean, you really take a deep dive into SATs and ACTs and how effective preparation is of a certain kind, and that this is, still a very important metric, right, at the center of college admissions. And you profiled, we've been talking about ideas, but you profile some remarkable characters in this book, including an SAT tutor in Washington, D.C. So tell us a little bit about what you learned about that, because the College Board, which does the SATs, is very sensitive to this idea that preparation works. And so they've actually tried to address the problem, right, by offering their own preparation, which didn't work. So why?
So there are a lot of angles to the standardized tests side of the story. So I'll start off by talking about Ned. So Ned Johnson is the tutor, the SAT tutor in Washington, D.C., who I spent some time with. He is I would say, the best and definitely the best paid SAT tutor in Washington.
How much does he earn?
He charges $400 an hour, and he bills more hours than anyone else at his company, which is the biggest company in D.C. Prep Matters, if there's anyone out there looking for a tutor in D.C. And so I sat and watched while he taught these mostly affluent kids, and it worked. I mean, there was a lot that was unusual about his methods. I mean, one of the things that I was surprised by is he didn't spend much time talking about algebra or reading comprehension. He spent a lot of time talking about stress. His theory was that these hyper anxious, affluent kids, the main reason that they were not getting the kind of ACT and SAT scores they wanted was because they got into the test and they were just so freaked out by their pressure they felt from themselves and their parents and the system that they froze up. And so he spent a lot of time talking to them about sleep and diet and exercise. But whatever it was, it worked. And so I would watch student after student see their scores go up by hundreds of points on the SAT, by 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 points on the ACT, which completely changes the kind of schools that you can get into. So once you spend some time with Ned at Prep Matters, it is hard to believe in the SAT as a fair measure of whether someone deserves to get into any given college. And so I mean, when I think about the time that I spent reporting on the College Board, in some ways this is not news, right? The fact that SAT scores correlate with family income has been true for decades. There were protests against the SAT, starting in the 60s and certainly in the 70s, where the inequities that were inherent in it were the main criticism of it. What changed during the years that I was doing this reporting was that the College Board got a new president, a man named David Coleman, who came in 2012. I first interviewed him in 2013, when he was at the beginning of this process to change, depending on your point of view, to change the SAT or to change the perception of the SAT. So he came up with a new version of the test, and he introduced a number of interventions that were supposed to make the SAT a force for equity instead of the force for inequity that it was perceived to be. And so I followed a lot of these interventions over time, and you're right. So many of them didn't work quite the way that they were supposed to, which is fine. It's good to try things out, and they don't always work. But when the College Board realized that these interventions weren't working as they had hoped, rather than be completely transparent and share that data with people, they did the opposite. So that's a lot of what I write about. And so in some ways, the news, the sort of conclusion that the SAT is continuing to help rich kids and hurt poor kids is nothing new. But the fact that the College Board felt the need to sort of change the story the way that it did, I think is news.
And some of that has to do with the fact that some colleges are dropping the SAT, right? And dropping standardized tests. Do you think that's the answer to this problem?
I think it can be the answer. I don't think it's as simple as that. So the number of schools are going test optional. There are a couple that I wrote about. I mean, I think I think any college should certainly consider it. In some ways, it's the most selective schools that would do best to consider it, because those institutions are going to get great applicants no matter what. And there are lots of ways that the SAT is distracting, I think, to admissions directors, because it is this nice round number. It is a nice round number that U.S. News gives you more points for having high rather than low. And I feel like...
And schools get penalized by U.S. News,
yeah,
right?
And so if you go test optional and a lot of students don't you don't report a lot of test scores, they will penalize you. So there are a lot of institutional reasons to keep test scores. While I think that institutions should certainly consider going test optional, I think it's also true that going test optional is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And lots of institutions have gone test optional, and it hasn't improved their equity at all. And I think the reason for that, I report in one chapter on this one admissions office at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. That's the article that's coming out in the New York Times Magazine this weekend. And they did go test optional. And they were able to improve their equity numbers a little bit. But what they and a lot of other institutions have found is that there are all these other pressures to keep admitting the sort of students that they've admitted before. And the main one is tuition.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because, I mean, I thought that was one of the most damning parts of the book, the fact that admissions, what we hear from admissions people, and I certainly hear it on my campuses, is striving for diversity, economic diversity especially. And the story out there is that, that there's all sorts of favoritism for people who come from low income, who are underrepresented in various ways, racially or ethnically. But you suggest there's another kind of conversation going on behind closed doors about who to admit, and that there's a real disconnect there. So we talk a little bit about that. What drives these admissions, the kinds of imperatives, the warring imperatives that they have?
Yeah, so I came to the NACAC, I think it's the National Association of College Advisors and Counselors, conference here in Boston a couple of years ago, and that's where that behind-the-scenes conversation was going on. It was the first time where I really realized what it feels like to work in an admissions office today. And so the beginning of my reporting was all about students who were applying to college. And when you're doing that, you just have this idea that it's the admissions people who hold all the cards. And then you start hanging out with the admissions people, and you realize they feel like totally stressed out. They're getting fired all the time. And they feel like all the pressure is on them. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that they are increasingly the department on campus that makes the money. So a lot of, when you go down below those institutions that are spending $200,000 per student, most selective colleges are tuition dependent. So they are looking for customers. They need people who can come in and pay their tuition. And in some ways, that's obvious, right? Like, we kind of know that. But that basic fact that when you're in the admissions office, you're looking for customers is not a story that colleges like to tell. And so that disconnect between the reality of the college admissions job and the rhetoric that sometimes comes from the admissions office, more often from the president's office, the communications office, that disconnect, I think, makes the admissions job so hard, because there is this kind of cognitive dissonance. And, these are like, you don't go into college admissions if you want to, like, keep rich people rich. Like, that's not really why you're driven to that job. And so I think that's partly why it's so stressful, because they do, they can see all of these great low-income students who they can't admit because they can't afford to admit them. And I feel like in many cases they can't afford to tell the story of what's really happening.
And it also feeds back into this SAT question too, because you point out that one of the ways to assure you're going to get enough paying customers is emphasize the SATs, since the best paying customers are the ones who have the highest SAT scores. So there's a kind of non-virtuous circle there.
Yeah, there's a real feedback loop, and then U.S. News is part of it as well. That if your SAT scores, your average SAT scores goes down, then your U.S. News ranking will go down. And there are studies that show that if your U.S. News ranking falls even 1 point, you get fewer applicants next year, and you get lower scoring applicants next year. So you have all of these institutional pressures that tell you to just keep doing what you're doing, which is admitting as many rich kids and as many kids with high test scores as possible.
And there are all these different ways to find rich kids too. I mean, high SATs are one. And then we have all these interesting sports that are represented on college campuses and nowhere else in society except maybe prep schools. Squash, rowing, tennis, sailing. And
you're in big trouble in Boston taking on rowing. Rowing is a great sport that is a big moneymaker on ESPN,
and it predicts success. And actually, you point out that being a college athlete does predict success, right? Because you're the kind of person that corporations often want to hire. right? Because you can talk sports.
Yeah, it's true. So this was well. So there are two stories inherent in there. So one is just when I was spending time at Trinity. This was Angel, the head of admissions there is a man named Angel Perez, who I spent a lot of time with. He was a low-income student himself who was very determined to bring in more diversity to Trinity. But half of his class was admitted early, and early admissions gives a real advantage to students with money. And half of them were athletes. And that was a surprise to me. And at Trinity, which is true of a lot of, especially Northeastern private liberal arts colleges, most of those athletes were, yes, from playing one of those prep school sports. Trinity happens to have the top-ranked squash team in the country, in case you weren't aware of that. They definitely are. And so if you're a squash player, you have a great advantage in terms of getting into Trinity. And like squash is not evenly distributed in our society today. But the other story that you're referring to, which is this a very great but a little bit frightening book, is a book called Pedigree by a sociologist from Northwestern named Lauren Rivera. It's a great book. I say in my book that by the time you get to the end of it, you either want to firebomb a bank or enroll your kid in squash lessons or both. And that was sort of the feeling that I had. And so this book is about the other end of the process when students are getting out of highly selective colleges and being interviewed for jobs. And so this sociologist, Lauren Rivera, embedded herself in the selection process for what she calls elite professional services firms, law firms and investment banks and consulting companies that are pretty much only interested in students from one of these most selective institutions. And I came across this book after spending a lot of time talking to first-generation students at highly selective institutions, and some of the pressures that they feel is that they really believe in the work. They think that what matters once you get to a elite college is doing great work and getting a 4.0. And then here are these hiring guys saying, like, we don't want those kids who are like spending all day in the library with the big glasses, getting 4.0s. We want people you can go out and have a beer with after work, right? And these are the jobs that are paying $165,000 right after graduation. And so it is one more way in which the advantages that people have, as early as middle school and high school pay off, not just in college, but coming out of college as well.
Yeah. So we're going to go to questions in a couple minutes. So if you want to open up your Slido and record your questions, that'd be great. So one effort to deal with this that I remember hearing a lot about a couple years ago, and I guess it was right before the recession, was that some elite schools go into a Needblind process, that anyone who could get in, they wouldn't even look at their ability to pay. And that this was going to increase the percentage of people from the lowest quintile of economic, of economics. Why didn't that work? It seems like such a obvious, generous solution to the problem.
It is, and there are a number of institutions that are Needblind, and that is a great idea. So there are a few problems with it, however. So one is that some are Needblind, but once they admit students who have a lot of need, they aren't able to fully meet that need. And so they admit you, but they are not willing to give you enough financial aid to allow you to come. When I talked to Angel Perez about this idea of Needblind admissions, the way he described it is that they might be need blind, but they're not wealth blind. So that there are so many pressures on an admissions director to admit wealthy kids that by the time all of those slots are filled, whether it's legacy students or children of donors or high-scoring SAT, people with high SATs or squash players, there are vanishingly few seats left. And so, there are ways you can see in a college application need, even if you are need blind. And I think it is impossible for most admissions directors to ignore those things. And I think that's why.
Like a certain zip code?
Yeah, everything. I just feel like it's everything. Everything I don't think that there are a lot of institutions that are just looking at bank balances only when they're making their admissions decisions, but there are so many factors that correlate with wealth, from early admissions to SAT scores to sports to legacy students, that all of the little decisions that they make incline them in this direction. And I mean, the reality is that most need-blind institutions have not that many students with a lot of need. So, it's a great idea, but in practice, it doesn't change things all that much.
It's an amazing kind of study about how things work, in our society, and the subtle ways that class reproduces itself without anyone trying to have that outcome. But the other thing the book is, and I can't stress this enough, is just a very deeply reported account of some individuals. And some great storytelling. It's not a work of sociology, although it uses sociology. And just to give people a taste of that, I was wondering if you could read a passage for us from the first 2 pages.
All right. Great, I will. So this is the very, very beginning of the book. It's a chapter called Wanting In, a section called Decision Day. When I walked up out of the subway on that cold spring afternoon, Shannon Torres was nowhere to be seen. We had arranged to meet at 4:15 p.m. in St. Nicholas Park in West Harlem, just down the hill from A. Philip Randolph Campus High School, where she was a senior, a few months away from graduation. But when I got to the park, I couldn't see her anywhere. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Shannon. "I'm to your left." I looked up the path and spotted her, sitting huddled over her phone on a bench about 50 yards away. She was dressed in layers against the chill, a beige barn jacket over 2 dark hoodies. Everything else she wore was black. Black sweatpants, big black high-top sneakers, black chunky glasses, and a black backward Nike baseball cap into which she'd stuffed her long, thick, dark hair. I walked over and sat down next to her. "Hi," she said. "I'm hiding here because I don't want anyone to see me." I had met Shannon only a couple of times before, so it was hard for me to say for sure if this constituted strange behavior for her, but it definitely seemed a little odd. Then she explained the situation. It was March 30. At exactly 5 p.m. that afternoon, every college in the Ivy League would simultaneously release their acceptance and rejection letters for next year's freshman class. I had dimly understood that the decisions were going out at some point that week, but I hadn't realized they would be arriving at the very moment Shannon and I had planned to meet. Shannon had applied to 2 Ivy League colleges, Princeton and the University of Pennsylvania. She wanted to get into Princeton, but she really, really wanted to get into the University of Pennsylvania. It had been her dream school, she told me, since 7th grade. And in less than an hour, either her dream would come true or it wouldn't. That fact was overwhelming her. When I'd interviewed her before, she had always seemed pretty cool. A Bronx girl, a streetwise Dominicana. But here on this bench in St. Nicholas Park, she was coming undone right before my eyes. "I'm the nervousest I've ever been," she said. Her hands were trembling. She looked like she was about to cry. "I think it's just like I've been working my entire life for this one thing," she explained. "It feels like everything is depending on this," which sounds dramatic, I know, but it's true.
It leaves you on the edge of your seat to find out what happens to Shannon. And in fact, Shannon is with us tonight. She's here. I don't know where exactly, but...
Hey, Shannon.
Oh, there she is. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Shannon.
I'm not going to tell you what happens. You need to read the book.
Thank you for letting me share that, Shannon. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Shannon. So I've got some of your questions here. The first is someone felt that there was a lot of criticism and even some cynicism in the discussion so far tonight. Where did you find the virtues in higher education in the course of your book work?
I did find some virtues. I really did. There were a few institutions that I wrote about that I felt most optimistic, and some of them were small. Experimental colleges. There was one that I particularly liked called Arupe College in Chicago, which is this new experiment run by a Jesuit priest named Father Katsouros, and it's an offshoot of Loyola University, which is a Catholic university that mostly admits high-scoring, well-off students. But the head of that school of Loyola wanted to expand the mission of Loyola, and so he started this 2-year college called Arupe, and it targets mostly low-scoring, low-income graduates of Chicago public schools who right now in Chicago do not have any great higher education options. There's a community college system in Chicago, but it has very poor outcomes for most students. And so Arupe takes this very different approach. Father Katsouros calls it a very intrusive model. So they really get involved in their students' lives. A lot of colleges like to kind of hang back and not get too close to their students, and Arupe does the opposite. It really leans in and tries to connect with them not only in terms of their educational life, but everything else. The other thing that I find fascinating about it is that they are not teaching sort of career-focused vocational classes. They are teaching philosophy and religion and a liberal arts curriculum on the belief that that is what's going to help their students make the transition from a 2-year school to a 4-year school. And not everybody succeeds, but they have a really high success rate for finishing a 2-year degree and going on to a 4-year school. It's a small model, so I don't think it's perfect for everybody, but I think it's a really promising one.
There's another, I think, pretty positive and really interesting example going on in your hometown at the University of Texas.
Yeah.
And they've come up with a whole new approach to offering opportunity to underserved people. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the University of Texas, I liked it so much that I moved to Austin. It has very interesting. I mean, I think that at the center of what makes UT special is this kind of accidental admissions policy. There's a Longhorn in the front row. It's kind of an accidental admissions policy, which is 20 years ago, the Texas state legislature passed this law called the Top 10% Law that mandated that the University of Texas in Austin had to automatically admit every student from any Texas high school who scored in the top 10% of their class by GPA, by high school grades. That has now shrunk down to the top 6% because so many people want to go to UT Austin. But still, 2/3 of each class is these automatic admits. And that has led to a very different kind of freshman class than you find certainly at these highly selective private institutions, but even at the flagship institutions in other states like the University of Virginia or the University of Michigan, which over the last couple of decades have come to resemble private institutions more and more as their funding has been cut back. So at UT, if the top 6% of a wealthy student in the suburbs of Dallas, they look a lot like the kind of students who do end up at the University of Michigan or the University of Virginia or an Ivy League school. They're mostly white, mostly wealthy, mostly high scoring. But then there are also students from the top 6% of their class from ranching communities in West Texas and mostly Latino communities in the Rio Grande Valley and mostly African-American communities in central Houston. And those students are very different than the kind of kids who go to the University of Michigan or the University of Virginia. They are much more likely to be low income, and they generally have lower SAT scores. And so the University of Texas brings all of these people together in their freshman class, and they educate them. Until a few years ago, there were these, as you might predict, these disparities in how well these different students did. And the students who had the lower SAT scores were graduating at lower rates. And that was just seen as like part of the deal. And then another accident happened, which is that Governor Perry, Rick Perry, was mad at UT, as he often is, and he was insisting that UT go to a more sort of business-like consumer model. And UT didn't want to do that. But they decided to throw him a bone by creating this program that would increase their four-year graduation rate, which was pretty low. It was at 50%, up to 70% within 5 years. And the man who got this job was a chemistry professor named David Loddy. And I spent 6 years following him and his work. And what he did was looked at the data and saw this trend and decided that the way he was going to get this graduation rate up was to focus on those students whose graduation rate was lowest. And so he put into action a number of programs to help them succeed. And it wasn't about dumbing their classes down. It was about giving them more tutoring support, giving them counseling, giving them advising, giving them mentoring, creating communities, especially in freshman year, where they felt a sense of togetherness and connection, not only with each other, but with the campus as a whole. They did internships in sophomore and junior and senior year on campus to increase their sense of belonging and connection. And within 5 years, not only had the whole UT graduation rate gone up 20 points, but the graduation rates for those most disadvantaged students had gone up by 25 or 26 points. And so that combination of those two sort of historical accidents created at UT both a different admissions system and a different student success system, both of which I think are really successful.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most hopeful stories in the book. Another question. Malcolm Gladwell argues people are better off graduating at the top of a less selective school than lower down in a more selective school. Thoughts?
Well, if there's one thing I know about being on book tour, you never contradict Malcolm Gladwell. He has agents, and they find you, and they cut you down, and you never sell another book. No, that's not true. So I've read that chapter in his book, and I understand what he's saying, and that there's some of that data seems very persuasive. However, I also can see the Carolyn Hawksby data and the Raj Chetty data that shows that going to Harvard does give you an advantage over going to whatever the other college that started with an H that he was comparing it to was. And that, yes, I think there are students who start in a STEM degree at Harvard and end up doing a philosophy degree, but they are still very likely to have incredibly powerful outcomes. So for individual students, absolutely, it can be true that it's better to be a big fish in a small pond, as he puts it, than a small fish in a big pond. But I am not convinced that overall, Raj Chetty's data and Carolyn Hawksby's data is wrong, and that I still believe that those most selective colleges are the ones that are giving the biggest boost.
Okay. Well, you guys can see these questions, but I guess I get to pick them. How does the large percentage of international students now at American universities help hurt American students?
I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like I would defer to the students to see what that's like. I mean, I think so. There are more international students. I think that can be a really positive thing at any.
Is that a function of finding full boat paying customers?
Yeah, I think it partly is. I think it's a combination. I mean, Trinity prides itself, for instance, on admitting international students who have financial need. But I do think the main pressure on a lot of institutions, certainly public institutions, over the last couple of decades has been to find students who can pay full fee. And so I think that is part of the draw for international students. The other place that we've seen it, and not international, but interstate students. So these flagship institutions like Michigan and Virginia and lots of others, when their budgets got cut, they realized, well, wait, out-of-state students pay more than in-state students, which was always supposed to just, give an advantage to students in the state, but now it actually does the opposite. And so out-of-state students are more appealing to those admissions offices, and now it's harder to get in if you're an in-state student. So I can imagine that that's part of the same function.
Okay, the last question is this one pointing to the future. As a parent of two toddlers, I'm asking you to predict the future. What major changes do you foresee in the higher education system in the next 20 years? And I guess I would couple that with one more of my own, which is if some incredibly reckless and visionary college president put you in charge of their admissions with the mission of returning American higher education to the role of aiding social mobility, what would you do?
Those are two pretty different questions. I can't really roll them together. So I love
the real future and the desired future.
Okay. So the real future, I don't know. I mean, certainly, like the financial pressure that some of these schools are under is intense, and people like Angel Perez point to these studies that show that in the near future there are going to be many fewer 18-year-olds, partly because after the recession, birth rates went down, and that there are especially going to be fewer 18-year-olds who can pay lots of money to go to selective colleges, and so I think those financial crises are going to continue, whether that pushes the trends in the same direction that they're going or in a more socioeconomically diverse direction remains to be seen. As to what I'm going to do in my next job, once I get this job that you're proposing me for, I think it depends on the institution. I mean, I think that if I was trying to do Angel Perez's job at Trinity, I do not think I could do it any better than he's doing it. And he would love to have a class that really looks like America, and he does not yet. And it's just the financial pressures on him are such that he can make only incremental change, and that is true at many, many institutions.
You're being too much of a realist, though. I mean,
okay, but but I think like the institutions
would
that
you
have,
abolish legacies, for example? If you didn't have to worry about
well, so I feel like the only way that I could do that is if I was working for one of the highest, so one of your employer, let's say, so those colleges can and should change their admissions policies tomorrow. There is no reason why those classes couldn't be much more socioeconomically diverse than they are. They can absolutely afford it. There are many excellent low-income students who I am sure are applying to Harvard and lots of other institutions. Their average SAT score would go down if they had a class that was, let's say, evenly distributed among the 5 income quintiles. But that I do not think that their academic quality would go down. That is the radical proposal that I think I would make. I would encourage.
What about squash?
I would definitely keep the squash team intact. No, I mean, I think a great goal for an admissions office would be to. So on Raj Chetty's charts, where he shows at every institution how much of the undergraduate classes from each economic quintile, and they all sort of go like this, with a huge bar in the top quintile of the highly selective institutions, and tiny bars down in the lowest economic quintile. I'd like to see a flat one, where each economic quintile has a fifth of the incoming class. I think that would be an amazing thing to see. I think it would be, as a professor, it would be an amazing thing to teach.
It would be. I would love to teach in that place.
Yeah, and it would be a rounding error in the budgeting for an institution like Harvard.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Will you join me in thanking Paul Tough?
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
We'll be both out in the lobby signing books.